So we know that from at least the start of the Second Persian War, Athens maintained a corps of 1,600 archers, based on the sources from both Aristotle on Athenian constitution and from Thucydides. And with Thucydides, it was a much later time period, about 70 or so years later, so this was actually a pretty consistent thing. And why 1,600 was consistent was probably because of the fact that it was a tax-funded, maintained corps. Therefore, it was a consistent way of being, well, consistent, but they were, in every single instance, considered to be bowmen, archers, particularly. Thucydides, on one hand, mentions them being reinforced with Athenian archers, and they were absolutely Athenian. There's some evidence, plenty of evidence to suggest that they had some foreigners up in there as well, because it seems to have been more on a volunteer basis, and because they were much smaller compared to the number of hoplites that they had. There was a core of what they call 300 Scythians around the walls of the Piraeus. It's open to question if they were actually Scythians or not, or if this was just some sort of symbolic term for a non-Greek foreigner that was, for whatever reason, enslaved there, and they just needed some kind of full-time guard on the wall. It's hard to say. The question then becomes, why exactly did Athens recruit archers from their population? Because we know that they did. We have one still that you can find on Attic inscriptions online that mentions the archers of a ship and where they are from. They mention their names. One, I believe, off the top of my head, was named Amanias of, I believe, Eleusis or Kytathonion. I mean, I'll put the text here on the video, just so you can actually see, because one of the things I like to do is share source texts rather than just tell you to go other places where you have to pay money to buy it. I really don't like that practice. I would rather just share the actual source itself. But we know that they were taken from in living within Attica itself. So we know that they were Athenians, at the very least living in Athens. Whether they were citizens or not is inconsequential at this point. They were Greeks, they were living in Attica, and they were also mentioned by the orator Lysias in 403 BC, when he was arguing against a measure of repatriating Athenian citizens after the 30 tyrants, after their overthrow, of repatriating Athenian citizens only on the basis of land ownership, which he says was a subversion of the ancestral constitution of Athens, and does not mention slingers, does not mention specifically light armed men. And Thucydides, in another part of his book, says that Athens did not have any properly trained light armed men, even though we know for absolute certain that they had Athenian archers. So archers were not considered light armed, at least not to the Athenians anyways. So it does tell us a lot about their practice as a whole militarily. But why did they specifically recruit archers from their populace and not slingers? Especially considering the idea that scholars on this topic believe that the reason for them recruiting archers and why anybody would go into the archer corps, despite the hoplite ethos, was that they were poorer at that point, especially considering that it was also tax funded. This makes sense, but I don't think this is the whole picture either. If that was really the case, why were they not recruited as slingers? Because that is the ultimate poor person's weapon. The ammunition just requires picking up rocks off the floor. It's very easy to make. It's very affordable. It doesn't take as much time to train. So if it was just a matter of them being in poverty, why did they not arm themselves as slingers? And more importantly, same thing with javelins. Why did they not arm themselves as javeliners? Because that also would have been much more affordable, a lot lower bar to be able to use, because it's just a stick with a pointy end on it, made of metal. It's very much more affordable than the much more costly bow, whether that be a simple bow or a composite bow, and arrows. And the bow and arrow does take a lot more time to train. I think we've kind of exaggerated just how much training it takes, to this idea that, you know, you need a whole lifetime. You basically need 1,000 years to be able to train just to be considered good at it. That's an exaggeration, but the way that scholars like to talk about it is just kind of silly. it really, in my experience, just to get to a useful draw weight, and my experience as an exercise physiologist and a kinesiologist, we know that based on novel stimulus and the fact that you're doing one thing pretty consistently, you can actually get to a relatively high draw weight with a very small frequency, basically like 30 minutes, maybe 3 times a week. You'd be able to get the actual strength that you need in as little as 2 years, just based on the evidence of strength training that we have in the modern day. It would have been the same then because they're still human, like us. Why did they specifically recruit archers and, in this case, not slingers or specifically light armed javelin throwers? And that's simply because they decided, whoever, the statesmen, the generals, the people in the higher ups, decided that they needed archers specifically. And why did they need archers specifically? The point of the matter is that when you think of the qualities of archery itself compared to slinging, there's a lot that archers can do and bring to the table that slingers and javelin throwers cannot, especially in the complexities of warfare in the Peloponnesian War. The point of the matter is that although they may not necessarily have the punching power of javelins, no matter how heavy the bow is, and they don't have the range of slings, when they get into things like skirmishing, arrows will always dominate in that case, because if you're talking about people who are moving around quite a lot, using their agility, basically trying to avoid any sort of arrow fire or avoid any sort of javelin throwing or slinging, it's just the point of the matter is because you can more precisely aim this, and because arrows travel faster than javelins inherently, no matter how powerfully it is thrown, it's always going to be faster than that. So it's a lot harder to avoid arrows from a slightly closer range than it would be javelins. And slings, you really realistically can only use it from extreme distances. Bows you can use from longer distances and shorter distances. There's a lot of room for error when it comes to the range itself. You can still use bows in very short range and even be able to load arrows much faster. In fact, we see a lot of these bow hand loads, which implies that loading arrows pretty fast for the efficiency's sake makes it more ideal when shooting in much closer quarters, skirmishing wide. They also don't need specifically javelin throwers because that's what they have hoplites for. There's no rule that says that hoplites couldn't somewhat break from the formation and throw javelins, because we know that's what archaic hoplites did. So the hoplites could easily double as quote-unquote heavy skirmishers because they are whatever they needed to be in that situation in order to be tactically successful. The other point of the matter is the spacing of it all. Now, archers still, even with armor and even with shields, benefit heavily from being intermixed with hoplites. So as long as they had some shieldmen there, you had a nice relationship of protector and protectee, and vice versa. The archer protects the hoplite just as much as the hoplite protects the archer. And this is great when countering things like cavalry, because in the Second Persian War at Salamis, the Athenian archers were actually very effective at neutralizing Persian cavalry, because if the hoplites were there, they wouldn't have been able to do very much, because cavalry at this time period just charges in, throws a javelin or shoots arrows, and then immediately comes back out. And so if you did not have missile soldiers there, the hoplites couldn't really do anything to fight against them. Slingers couldn't really do anything because, well, I'll get to that. The thing about slinging is that they can't really stand inside a formation much closer. And the reason why is, like, if you take a sling itself and you try to, say, stand next to a tree or something like that, which can act as see how much it's like, say I'm standing right behind, just think of this right here as a hoplite buddy of mine, and if I am a slinger, right, the idea is that, let me put this up, there we go. The idea is that if I am right here and I need to use slings trying to fight against cavalry or really anybody else, right, I could possibly do it, but I'm also potentially hitting the guy in front of me, or if I'm right here, right, there's a possibility I could hit my guy at this point. So you'd have to do other things like it can be done, but you have to take into consideration that you've got guys all around you. There's a reason why slingers need a lot of space, and there's a reason why if you go to any YouTube video to find people slinging, they're not standing right next to things. They have a wide open field. And that brings me to another point, and that is the effects of facility and training itself. We have this idea that these are way easier to understand and use, and that is a big factor in how people choose their weapons, and that is true. But there are also lifestyle factors and lifestyle limitations, such as urbanization, living in villages or demes. You may not necessarily have the right facilities to actually train a sling, even with how easy it is. The reason being is that it's very easy to mess one of these up on the first one because it's all about release timing. If you were like setting up, like you need a wide open space, and there's a reason again why YouTube slingers go out to the sea and shoot things out at the seas, because there's no possibility of hitting anything accidentally. You're just shooting into the water. If I did this here in my backyard, I've had it so happen that even with soft balls, right, standing really close to that thing right there, I shoot it over my fence because I have bad release timing at that point. And it starts making me think that if you had just a random villageman potentially doing this, that's a potential for damaging somebody else's property, hitting somebody else's house. All right, that's not exactly something that's inducive to good training, because you don't want to get into a lawsuit at that point. But with a bow, because the space that you need, because you can precisely aim a bow itself, because of that, I don't have to worry about these arrows going over my fence unless I'm specifically aiming over my fence. So I can always just shoot at that, and I never have to worry. I've never had an arrow go over the fence, maybe under it, but never over it. So you can actually be in much more enclosed spaces and use this and train this much more effectively. In a way, this is actually even better for more social limitations, because again, you can even, you know, if you set up some sort of target, you can even do it in your own house if you want. So you can be far more precise with bows and arrows than you can be with slings. Slings are really great for lobbing rocks at very long distances at very big phalanx wide targets. But bows and arrows are really good for, well, not necessarily doing that, because you can't really penetrate a shield wall as well from the front, but these are perfect and fantastic for dynamic skirmishing, right? Which we know existed. The Greeks did not only just fight pitched battles, there was a lot more to Greek warfare than just pitched battles. There was a lot of skirmishing involved. There were sieges. It was very complicated. Slingers have their place, but they were ultimately kind of useless against cavalry because the cavalry can easily run them down. And like I said, the spacing required to actually use one of these things is a lot more to be able to use it reliably because of the radius itself. If you're doing something like this, trying to throw, this goes around your head, it could hit somebody else right next to you. But with bows, because the actual radius of work is really this small compared to something like this, when you're working inside an intermixed formation of spearmen and archers. So they can get that protection that they need. As you can see, I can actually, it's almost like peeking out from beside somebody, but think of this as a person almost. I can be within very narrow spaces and use this. And it doesn't affect my accuracy. I can easily do it. And it doesn't get in the way of anything. So that's the same thing with being on ships. Ships are a little bit more enclosed quarters, and they need weapons that they can use in tighter quarters, which you cannot do as easily with a sling. You need more accuracy at the relative distances on a ship and in a skirmish that you are going to need. You need accuracy, you need efficiency, you need speed. These just, they may not have the range of slings, but they are just, you know, this is just ultimately the better close range skirmishing weapon than a sling ever would be. And you can also carry more ammunition than you would javelins. Javeliners may be able to carry like 5. You can probably carry like 24 or 30 or something like that. And while the ammunition itself is not as economically feasible, you want to make your shots count anyways. Therefore, the precision that you get out of this is fantastic. So in summary, the reason they did not recruit slingers and javelin throwers specifically from their population is 1, hoplites can easily act as javelin throwers if they need to be. 2, slingers need a lot more space to be able to work, and the hoplite phalanx itself only needed archers specifically because they can work in tighter spaces, so they can be inside the phalanx itself and use their bows much more reliably. And the same thing goes on ships. A lot more room for error because bows can be used at a distance just as short. Bows themselves also have a lot more inherent precision to them compared to the more general accuracy sling. Not to say that you can't be precise with a sling, but it's just not built for that compared to being able to actually line up an arrow with the target. Because of these factors, they are very good anti-light infantry, anti-cavalry, and extremely dominant in close-range skirmishing. They're also ideal on the use of ships, which there is an argument to be made that archers are associated with naval power. Since Polycrates the Samian tyrant built a navy of 100 ships, and Herodotus found it necessary to mention that he had 1,000 archers, which had to have meant something in his naval and military dominance in the middle of the 6th century. Ultimately, bows and arrows just had a lot more to contribute to the way that the Athenians waged warfare both at sea and on land than specifically maintaining a corps of slingers and javeliners would. The Ionians, which the Athenians were an Ionian dialectic group, had their ancestral god as Apollo, and Ion was an archer, their ancestral king, or a warlord, according to Aristotle. It's not particularly consistent. I mean, mythology is not really consistent or canon or anything. But at least in Euripides' play, he is an archer defending the site of Delphi before he comes to Athens itself. Archers had been a normal part of ancient Greek warfare. Its forms, their social standing and whatnot may have changed over time, depending on new cultural factors and socioeconomic ones, but they were always there. And it's just a representation of the more things change, the more they stay the same.